This is Smarter Cars, a podcast about autonomous vehicles.
This is the finish line. The Stanford racing team has made its way into the history books.
But the most important thing for me is it actually doesn't matter who comes first. It matters that we as a community achieve it.
Early in a technology, 1,000 flowers should bloom.
Welcome to Smarter Cars. This is your host, Michelle Kairouz. Our guest today is Nico Larco, an associate professor of architecture at the University of Oregon and co-founder and co-director of the Sustainable Cities Initiative, a multidisciplinary organization that focuses on sustainability issues as they relate to the built environment. We're talking to him today about his recent research on the secondary impacts of autonomous vehicles on cities, including the effects on transportation, street design, real estate, and land use. Nico, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you and your team are doing at the University of Oregon?
Sure. So we have an organization here called the Urbanism Next at the University of Oregon, which works across a range of different disciplines, urban design, planning, policy, architecture, law, journalism, looking at how autonomous vehicles, e-commerce, and the sharing economy are going to be impacting cities, and city form, city design, and city development. So in this work, we're less interested in the technologies themselves, which I know is kind of a funny thing for me to say on this podcast, which is very much interested in the technologies. But what we're really interested in is what we call the secondary impacts of these technologies. So how is it that these emerging technologies, AV being a really large one, are going to be affecting things like land use, land valuation, equity concerns, changes in street design and neighborhood design, pressures on sprawl, municipal finance, all these types of things. So these secondary impacts. And what we found is that whereas there's a tremendous amount of research, fantastic research happening on the technologies themselves, and there's starting to be some great research as well on what we call the kind of first order effects of the transportation sector. So will this affect mode choice, or how will it affect vehicle miles traveled, congestion, these types of things? There's very little that looks at these second order effects, these secondary effects, as I mentioned before. And so, one of the benefits that we have at the University of Oregon is that it's a fairly flat organization, and we work a tremendous amount across a lot of disciplines, which has given us a great base, both within the university, but also then making contacts throughout the university. So we've been working with the public sector, the private sector, and academia across the country, putting together people who are working on these topics and trying to, on the one hand, shed light on the topic, making sure people are understanding what kinds of things are happening, trying to compile and organize and curate, we'll say, some of the best research that's out there, and trying to push a whole lot of research on our own.
That's terrific. And you guys have a great website. I'll put some links to your articles and materials in our show notes so everyone can take a look at a lot of the research you guys are doing.
Great.
And you're hosting a conference in March, is that right?
Yeah, so this is tremendously exciting for us. We actually hosted a workshop last year, which is really the precursor to this, where we had people from around the country coming together. We did one actually here in Portland, and then we did one as part of the Autonomous Vehicle Symposium, where we had people from around the country come together and talk about what some of these secondary impacts might be. And that's grown into what we're doing this year, which is a much larger event. So this is March 5th through 7th here in Portland, Oregon. It's the National Urbanism Next Conference, and it's a collaboration between us, the University of Oregon, and Urbanism Next, along with the American Planning Association, the American Society of Landscape Architects, the American Institute of Architects, and Urban Land Institute. So these are the professional organizations for architects, urban designers, planners, landscape architects, and developers. And it's the first time these organizations are coming together to talk about these topics and these secondary impacts. We're kind of in this funny place where, 2 years ago, for people outside maybe the tech industry, this all seemed a little bit of science fiction and this interesting kind of side thing, and now it's very quickly become, as a friend of mine from the Bay Area, Jerry Tierney, likes to say, it's become science fact. And so all of a sudden people are waking up to, oh, what exactly is this thing, and what are these impacts? Yeah. So we're gathering people from around the country. We've got a great group of people coming. Robin Chase, one of the founders of Zipcar, Jeff Tumlin from Nelson Nygaard, Susan Shaheen from UC Davis, just to name a few, to talk about all these things, the impacts of autonomous vehicles, e-commerce, and the sharing economy on cities. And it should be a great event. We'd love for people to come out to that.
Terrific. And that sounds great. Is there, who do you think might benefit from attending? It sounds like there's a fair amount of folks from the urban planning community there. Is it the kind of conference that someone who's more on the industry side of autonomous vehicles could benefit from?
Yes, absolutely. So there's definitely going to be a lot of people in the planning, design, development fields being part of this. We have a lot of people coming from the private sector or the public sector as well. So people who are in government and trying to figure out what to do with these pieces. And I think there's a really important place and role for people who are on the technology side and on the kind of OEM side, which is that as the more that we look at this and the more that we talk to people and the more that we see the range of impacts that are going to be happening, the more that we think that it could be that the largest barriers for the rollout of some of these technologies aren't actually the state of the technology itself, but the environment in which they start being introduced and the reaction to those things. So as we look at some of these impacts, and I hope we'll talk a little bit more about this later in this podcast, but as we think about some of the impacts this might have on things like municipal budgets, or land values, or organizations of design, or organization of streets and neighborhoods, there will be some heavy issues that cities need to deal with. That people on the street need to be dealing with, and the repercussions might not be, if it's not done well, might not be all that positive. And so, my sense is if the OEMs want to make sure that they're being able to introduce these products into an environment that it's going to be both welcoming and have positive effects that will continue to have a positive view of the industry and of the technology, it's really important for them to get ahead of these kinds of questions, to be thinking about them, and to be proactively trying to plan for how to make sure that the impacts are positive, that they do good things for communities. Some of the people that we have coming to the conference, in fact, some of the sponsors of the conference, include things like Uber and Lyft, Ford, Chariot, Via, are all going to be part of the conference. And we had a great conversation with people at Ford just recently who are absolutely, of all the companies we've spoken to, I think Ford is slightly ahead in this, of really thinking through some of these secondary impacts and understanding that these environments are going to be coming into, the reactions to them, the way that municipalities and citizens, firms, the whole piece kind of deal with the secondary impacts will be critical to the rollout.
Well, it sounds like a great opportunity for lots of dialogue at your conference. So looking forward to that. Sounds like it'll be great. So let's dive into some of these secondary impacts. I was thinking maybe we could address some of them kind of in the order in which they're going to start impacting cities. I think some of the impacts you mentioned are more short-term, things we might expect to see right away, and others might be things that play out over 10 years or so. What are some of the more immediate impacts that you think cities will start to see once autonomous vehicles are introduced? And maybe we can take as an assumption that AVs are introduced in autonomous taxi services that are sort of very cheap compared to current TNC or taxi prices. And let's assume there's sort of a decent amount of coverage in major cities.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I'll start by saying something that we say a whole bunch, which is that the impacts of AVs. We already have AVs on the model of AVs working right now, and that is the TNCs. We always say TNCs are AVs, just that they happen to have drivers. Because the way that we use them, the model of how we use them, the way that they're going to be affecting the way we move around, and kind of the secondary effects are already in place. So the future's arrived. I like to tell people who are still a little bit weary of like, will the AVs really happen? I said, it doesn't matter exactly when they arrive. We're already in this new reality. So I mean, that's the whole move, obviously, to mobility as a service. But with TNCs, we're already seeing some of these impacts, and they will only get exacerbated as we continue to move towards TNCs, and will only get exacerbated even more when AVs arrive. So one of the biggest ones is this question of parking and parking use, and this just has for people who are not in the fields of like planning and design, urban design, understanding cities. Parking is probably the largest thing that we deal with. There's a old saying in architecture that form follows function, and I've always corrected it and said, no, form follows parking. Everything works around parking. And if you think about it, like the organization of our cities, definitely streets have a whole lot to do, kind of for how we're organized. But parking has just been a tremendous driver of, no pun intended there, of how cities organize. So, the amount of space that it takes up, the way it spreads uses apart, the fact that it's not exactly all that friendly to oftentimes to other modes, the fact that it's a huge burden, we'll say, on the development side of things, right? So no developer wants to build a whole lot of parking or no more parking than they absolutely need, because it's things that you're building that end up not generating revenue oftentimes, and you can't put it takes up space that you would like to put other things into. And so this idea that we're already seeing with TNCs, reductions of parking utilization. Obviously, we're seeing it in airports, we're seeing it in large venue, and we're starting to see it in just general, in urban and more suburban areas. Is this a reduction in parking utilization? And when we start getting to that reduction, like huge things start changing. All of a sudden, we could be developing denser, much easier. So think the largest single land use by area in any city, according to Donald Shoup, who's the granddaddy of all things parking, is parking. It's the largest single land use on the surface of most cities. And so when all of a sudden that changes, you can have areas that you can start building denser, closer to cities, right? So think about what that does for the affordability of housing, fantastic things. Think about what it does for the opportunity to create kind of buzz and density, fantastic things. You end up having huge opportunities for redevelopment in even suburban areas. So you take a typical suburban strip mall, and 40%, 50% of the land area is actually parking. Right. And so if we say like, parking is going to be reduced by half, and there's studies that show that it's going to be going down, 10, 15% of what we've got right now, especially if we go to the model that you talked about where we've got fleets. That's a huge amount of land that can be redeveloped. So you're going to be seeing a lot of consolidation, in suburban areas. And, if we have 10 strip malls in our town, maybe we'll end up having like 4 as things move together. You no longer need to have large office parks out in the middle of nowhere, right? Get rid of all that parking, and all of a sudden, why would this thing be in the middle of nowhere? Why not putting it places where there can be amenities nearby? So huge opportunities with that. And as I mentioned, one of the impacts we'll see as well is this huge increase in the feasibility of projects and development projects. Parking is oftentimes a burden to development projects. And so if you don't have to build that stuff and you can take that space and put more units on there or more development on there, all of a sudden there's these huge opportunities.
What parking do you think will still be needed? Let's start with parking sort of in a downtown location. You mentioned that there's, developers have to have all these parking lots and garages, and that some of that would go away. Assuming that the AV is dropping you off at work, what parking will still be needed? Where does the car go after it drops you off? And, even if it's a TNC or autonomous taxi service, presumably they're being stored somewhere, and they have to wait around for the next passenger or find the next ride. So How do you see that playing out downtown?
There's going to be, my sense is, three things. One, there's going to be some parking that kind of looks the way it looks today, because there might be some people who still have, their own cars, and might be some people who still want to have that piece there. It still won't look exactly like today, because there's going to be, the car, let's say, dropped me off this morning at my office, and there's no need for the car to park right next to the office. It could go a little further away, right, and find a lot that's cheaper and easier, and just leave the car there, and then I'll call it to come and pick me up when I'm going. So there will be some of that. There will be kind of these staging areas, so dealing kind of like with a slack in demand of cars kind of waiting for the next ride. It's kind of funny, right? Because right now, I take Lyft and Uber a whole lot, and I always ask the drivers, like, what do you do when you don't have a ride? Yeah. And they're always kind of repositioning, trying to find a specific place. And I said, do you ever go there and just stop? And often they don't. They kind of just keep driving around, which is my sense is that when this goes to real kind of automated fleets, there will be some algorithms that say, just relocate the cars in these key locations and just let them stop so that they can stay somewhere. So we'll need those kinds of staging areas. And then there's going to be this really interesting new typology, which we've never had before, which is fleet storage. Right. So what happens where, a place where the car can get, recharged. I have a strong feeling these things are going to be going electric. There seems to be a lot of points in that direction. That they can get cleaned up, that they can be stored for really slack moments, extreme slack moments in demand. And where are these fleet storage areas going to be? Well, they're not going to be downtown, right next to your office building, and they're not going to be in high rent areas. What they're going to be is in lower rent areas, probably with a really important piece, high access to utilities. So that we can get all the charging that needs to be happening done, and close to some large piece of infrastructure, arterials or freeways or major roads that they can get in and out of easily. So these are this new, and my sense is they could be quite large. My sense is something like Uber or Lyft are going to have some of these larger type storage facilities and kind of do all of their maintenance and charging in that one place.
Right. Do you think that there's an avenue for using existing downtown parking structures for pickup and drop off? I know one of the big concerns, even with the TNCs and certainly with the move to AVs, is how are we going to get sort of enough curb space, enough places without disrupting the flow of traffic for cars to pick up and drop off passengers? I know at SFO that recently they were opening up some of their short-term parking facilities as kind of drop-off and pickup zones and encouraging people to do that. Do you think that might work from a street design and traffic design perspective?
Yes. So I think you're absolutely right. Like the curb management, how we find our car, get into our car, I think is going to be a huge issue. I always like the visual of if any of the people listening have ever been to a suburban school at pickup time, right? And there's this massive backup of cars, waiting to pick up their kids. Now imagine that's happening, right? That's the end of our workday and we'll all go down. But now imagine that your kids don't know what the car looks like. Right. I mean, that is the kind of chaos that could ensue. So there's the figuring out how to manage that, I think, will be a really important piece. And I think there's two opportunities here. On the one hand, it will be a source of revenue generation for cities, especially if we end up going electric. We're going to have to be finding new kind of forms of revenue for all sorts of infrastructure. And managing the curb will be one of those moments. The beautiful thing is that it can be a revenue generating moment, but it can also be a behavior kind of modifying moment. So we can figure out where is it that we want to have the drop off happen. If you were to go, 2 blocks off the arterial, maybe there's a lesser charge to get people to spread out and not create congestion in these kind of critical moments. Mm-hmm. And so there's huge opportunities for that. In terms of using existing parking lots, absolutely. So those kinds of things can happen. You can kind of see. I always picture kind of these bus depots, where everyone's going to get on and off in the station. They these fingers of lanes, something like that happening with TNCs, AV TNCs coming in. I think that's absolutely happening. Parking structures themselves, I find less possible, mostly because once you get into that kind of it might happen in the transition period, but when we start thinking about real fleet storage, right, and like these cars are going to come in and drop people off and like get maintained and stuff, the parking lots are just not the right shape for these things, and don't have the right kind of organization for them. So I think that one will be harder to have happen. But I think there's a huge opportunity for all sorts of designers to start thinking about what those interfaces might look like, and how to incentivize types of behavior that are going to be most efficient and work best with our cities.
Sticking with parking, another place that people park today is at venues like ballparks. You mentioned shopping malls, but there's also things like concert halls and restaurants and other destinations. If people are getting dropped off there, kind of how do you think that space usage is going to change? Is it going to change where we locate these things?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, this is one of the beautiful pieces of this new technology coming in, as I mentioned, with parking. All of a sudden, there's tons of places that, you would never think of trying to put some large capacity venue, even though you would love for that venue to spill out into, all sorts of like street life and buzz. But just because of the parking demand, it makes it really hard. Well, all of a sudden, those things become possible. You do end up running into, as you're saying, this problem of, well, what do we do with pickup and drop off? That can get really, really squirrely. Mm-hmm. We're already seeing, I've heard from a number of consultants, transportation consultants from around the country, that we're already seeing reductions in the number of, the amount of parking that's being used in these types of venues. Oftentimes, people are very excited to be able to drink and take their lift home, as opposed to having to put their car in there. And so we're seeing that drop off absolutely happening, and then the question of how people are picked up and dropped off to these locations. There's a lot of people who are piloting different ways of doing it. So right now, I know Uber in DC has a pilot trying to figure out how many different. I think there's a pilot that's either happening or about to happen in Austin as well, where they're looking at, how do I incentivize a couple different pickup and drop off points, and maybe each one has a slight charge to it, to get people to walk the 2 or 3 blocks, outside of this main area, so that they, individuals are self-dispersing into a way that's going to make it much easier for the pickup and drop off to happen. And I think those types of pilots are really important right now. Right.
I mean, to your point, TNCs are really in some ways acting as a test for how all of this is going to work when the vehicles are automated. And so it's already being tested. What about parking where people live? I mean, either, a city like San Francisco has a lot of residential neighborhoods with single family homes and driveways and garages. There's also lots of condo or apartment buildings. I understand that maybe the rules will be different going forward for how much parking a developer needs to include in a new building. But, a city like San Francisco is pretty built up. And how would it affect existing parking for residential areas?
Yeah. So I'm going to take that question to 2 parts. So one of them is the question of San Francisco, the specific kind of model, or cities that are really built up and dense and already have, San Francisco has parking maximums, right? You're not allowed to build parking in certain areas. And the second part is this question of how it might affect residential kind of applications or locations. So in terms of cities that are built up, I think, for instance, San Francisco, as we get AVs happening in the cities, the parking effects are not going to be that strong because they already have like huge limitations on parking and large kind of leaning and support from transit to make the whole kind of mobility puzzle work. You look at places like New York City. Similarly, the amount of the disincentives for driving that already exist, will make it that the shift of all of a sudden not needing parking will not be that difference in the typologies. You get to cities like Portland and parts of Seattle, and that starts to be, there's going to be more effect. You see more parking in these areas, but then you get into cities like Dallas or Atlanta, and the equation completely changes. Right? I mean, there's just a tremendous amount of surface parking that's happening throughout the city, and so these places are going to be extremely affected by that. So it's going to play itself out differently in different types of cities, different geographies, and different. We always like to think of in urban areas, suburban areas, small towns, and rural as the four geographies that we really need to be paying attention to. In terms of the question with residential, one of the big questions we have is, will people own their own cars? And if they still own their own cars, they might have a place that they want to have it at their house. My sense is that we're going to be getting this whole mix of different models where some people have it in their own house, some people own their own car, but it goes down to one of these charging fleet storage areas to get maintained and cleaned up and charged, and then they'll come back to the house when you need them. It could be that we have more groups of people kind of plugging into these things. So if there's no certainty that we're going to need cars in at our homes, right? Or even if we have our own private cars, that we will need them at our homes. And so, that would change a whole lot of things. So, think about the prototypic archetypal, way that we've developed in this country with single family homes and, the garage, the 2, 3, 4 car garage. Now, if you go in, the snout houses where have the garage up in front of the entire house, so you actually can't even see the front door. Models of that in Arizona. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden this completely changes the equation. The kind of reliance that we've had, or the influence the automobile has had in design will dramatically change. And so there, great things, right? So we can actually put front doors directly back onto streets. We can have, porches. We can have this great interaction between the street and the house and units, which would be fantastic. You also think about things, in not so much in denser cities, but there's an enormous typology around the country of suburban multifamily housing. It's like 9 million units, 10 million units in the country is suburban multifamily housing, which are typically these buildings that are just, in this sea of parking, just endless parking lanes that go around and around. We won't need those types of things anymore, right? Again, those typologies can now shift. The amount that it's hard to overemphasize how much parking has dominated the way that we think about the built environment. So it'll really open up a lot of opportunities.
And, are we going to see the conversion of garages into living space? I know, like in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of these ranch homes that are not very big, but are quite expensive given the value of land in that area. And some people already have, converted the garage into living space and just sort of taken it out, given that it doesn't snow here and people don't need some place to put their car inside. But do you think that's a trend that we'll see? Absolutely.
I mean, I don't think there's too many homeowners or even just renters, that would not like more space for something else. And so, if you're in the design field thinking about garage conversions, will be a cottage industry coming up. And not only not only the garage, but the whole driveway and the whole the amount of space all that takes up. I think there's going to be a huge shift to those things. Absolutely.
Right. So let's go back and talk a little bit about street design. We touched a little bit about issues around the curb, and there's been a lot of discussion about how cities might regulate the curb, and some complaints from cyclists that people pulling over to the curb using TNCs are causing problems there. I took a look at NACTO's blueprint that they came out with for some ideas about how streets might be designed differently when we have autonomous vehicles. And I'm just wondering how you think cities could use street design to address both kind of traffic flow and apportioning different parts of the street for different modes of travel, and how you think cities might start to think about those things.
So that's a great question. And I'll say the very first question that cities need to ask themselves, and we talk to cities all over the country about this, that the question isn't how do I accommodate AVs into my city, because cities are not should not be in the business of I just need to accommodate AVs. Cities should be in the business of how do I make this community what my community wants it to be. How do I what are my community's values? What is it that how do people want to live? What kind of quality of life? How do we leverage this fantastic, interesting, and love it or not, it's coming new technology to help with those things? And so, there's one of the biggest issues. So, there's a whole lot of work in this country of trying to create, more biking and walking in the country. We have an obesity epidemic in the country, and there's no doubt that the amount that we are tied to our cars and the amount that we have sedentary lifestyles is a big problem with that. And so, trying to create the design of cities that helps foster this type of walking and biking is really important. One of the largest limitations in creating biking and walking, excuse me, biking and walking kind of great places is the amount of available right-of-way. Like how much of the street can we actually use for these things? Well, there's a possibility that with AVs, all of a sudden, our lanes are going to get narrower. Potentially, we'll need less of them, and just depend on efficiency. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And we won't need on-street parking, for instance. And so all of a sudden, like the right-of-way, there's a whole lot of it that comes up for grabs. And the question for cities is, well, what are you going to do with that space? And one of the important things is, well, how do you prioritize what you want to do? So, Seattle and Portland have both taken policies, adopted policies that say, the priorities in our city is going to be pedestrians in this order: pedestrians, cyclists, transit, freight, shared autonomous vehicles, individual use autonomous vehicles, and then not allowed, would be something like zero occupancy vehicles, or extremely discouraged would be zero occupancy vehicles. And so by having policies like that, what they're saying is, okay, and when this available right-of-way comes up for grabs, this is how we are going to organize this space to help with these community goals. Now, there's going to be pressures in all directions, though, because one of the big issues that we've seen from studies of what's going to happen, as you're already seeing it with TNCs, and you're going to see it even more when AVs arise, is a huge increase in the amount that we consume transportation, right? When transportation gets easier and cheaper, we tend to consume more of it. That's been historically true, and we've no reason to believe that this is going to be any different. And so as you consume more transportation, what that means is more vehicle miles traveled and more congestion in cities. And so there's going to be pressure for, even though I need a thinner lane eventually, once we move all the way over to one type of a vehicle, that there's going to be pressure to say, well, maybe I still want to add an extra lane because now we have more cars on the street and more pressure to be moving around. And that, I think, will be a large fight. There's also this question of the interaction with modes. I've seen too many fantastical kind of models that engineers have put together of cars zipping at each other and breakneck speeds through intersections and just missing each other. and I always think that's great, but that city has no people. As soon as we have things like we have pedestrians and crosswalks and cyclists, then that model doesn't even make sense. There's going to be other pressure in cities, and I would say those are kind of important things. The people are kind of important parts of cities. So I hope we don't all of a sudden just erase them from the equation. But figuring out how those things all come together will be really, really important. You also have questions of things like what happens, as AVs have algorithms that don't allow them to run over people, thank goodness. What happens when all of a sudden, a couple of people decide they all want to walk in the street? And do we have like a critical mass ride of, instead of it being 1,000 cyclists, it's just 2 that are completely shutting down the city? And how do we deal with those types of things?
Right. What do you think about, you mentioned, bike lanes and increasing use of the right-of-way for things like cycling, and cities perhaps prioritizing that. Is there another place to put the bike lane besides, between the place where cars and buses are driving and the sidewalk? Like, should there be a raised up sidewalk in the center, like a center lane for bicycles, maybe that's up on a curb, or some other place? It seems like a really hard thing to do both. I know you start seeing kind of physical barriers for bike lanes, little trees and things like that. But has any thought been given to sort of how to redesign streets if you wanted to prioritize bike use?
Yes. So it's difficult. So one of the issues, so there are some models where, the bike lane's in the middle of the street. You need to make sure it's protected, right? Obviously, I guess that'll be easier with AVs because they won't go careening out into that area. But there are models of that. The difficulty is all those cyclists need to become pedestrians at some point, right? So they're going to have to get to the curb to wherever it is that they're going, or they're going to have to turn. And when they're in the middle of the lane, or in the middle of the street, it makes it much, much more difficult for that. There are options. So, for instance, this idea of cycle tracks. So if you have the pedestrian kind of around the sidewalk, and then you have an area, you see this all over in Copenhagen and Amsterdam. We've got a few of them here in Portland. This space where the bikes can go between the sidewalk and the street. So you could have, a sidewalk, a bike lane, a little bit more like a buffer, a little bit of a sidewalk, and which is large enough for people who are getting in and out of cars or transit to be accessing. Then all of a sudden, they can get out, they can get off the bus, and they're standing there in like a 2-foot strip, look to both sides, and then cross a cycle track whenever there's a space for that. So those types of things are absolutely possible, and fantastic opportunities. And there's already been designs. In fact, I was just in New York a couple of weeks ago, and there's a whole bunch of pilot projects that are looking at exactly doing that. Pulling out where this kind of buffer zone for interaction with the street that doesn't have to be right where the bikes are going.
Right. It just strikes me that if curb space is becoming more valuable, should we create more curb space?
Yeah. Yes, that'd be good. And the other thing to think about is, and this may be getting too in the weeds with the topics that the podcast is interested in, but you also have to think about it as a network. Not every street has to do everything. Right. Not every street has to have be absolutely fantastic for cyclists. Not every street has to be the place where we all get dropped off. So we can think about, there might be, a street off of the main street, or a street, or certain parts of streets, or certain streets where we prioritize one kind of mode over another.
Yeah, that's a really interesting approach. I know, like in downtown San Francisco, you have one-way streets, right? You have, they alternate. And so people know, all right, if I need to go that direction, I need to go over a couple blocks to go in that direction. And you could sort of see that kind of divvying up as well.
Absolutely.
You mentioned zero occupant vehicles, and when you were thinking about different things that ought to be prioritized, and you also mentioned kind of the increase in VMT that people think will be likely to happen when mobility is available for everyone at a pretty cheap cost. I'm a little confused about why there's so much concern or focus on the people in the vehicle. For this reason, it seems like an imperfect proxy for something else. Maybe it's the necessity of the trip. In other words, whether you get in your car and you drive to CVS and pick up some items and drive back, or whether your automated vehicle went by itself and picked up those items and came back, it's the same number of traffic trips, right?
Mm-hmm. So yes, absolutely. But, there's the other side of it, which is, let's just say, I was going to come do this podcast, and I came in and all of a sudden said, I'll just I don't want to pay for parking. I'm just going to let the car circle for a while. And I come in and do this podcast. And so we have all of a sudden congestion for no good cause, right? So that's not really a trip. It's just sitting out there on the streets and clogging the streets. The other thing is that, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I hear that point. And isn't that really just vehicle miles traveled, where it's like, all right, if you're going to run around and take up street space, I mean, in other words, if there was a person in the car, if your wife was in the car and you said, all right, you go drive around for a while I do a task and then come back and get me, it wouldn't make the driving around any less objectionable just because there was a person in the car,
Oh,
right?
absolutely, absolutely. So I mean, I guess you're right somewhat in that having a person in the car is somewhat of a burden, and we're just leaning a little bit on the fact that people don't just want to drive around for no reason, and therefore, they're going to make decisions to avoid that. But the other thing, I mean, a lot of the questions, so not only zero occupancy, but lower occupancy vehicles, if we continue down the path that we're at, right, which with kind of these the auto-dominated kind of areas, and you all of a sudden add more congestion and more trips and more VMT, well, our infrastructure can't handle those things, right? And so part of the idea of having this, like thinking about occupancy, is that it is unbelievably inefficient the way that our transportation system works right now. I mean, it's almost incredible when you step back from it. 95% of the time, our cars sit idle, right? They're parked. Of the time that we use them, most of the time, the vast majority of the time, we only use 20% of the capacity, right? 1 out of 5 seats in a car. Right. So the inefficiency in the system is just staggering. And so when we think about, with the growth that we're seeing in cities, with the growth in VMT and congestion that we'd be seeing, and all of a sudden with this new ability to have, this app-based kind of figuring out where we're all going, and cars that are much more flexible and dynamic, wouldn't it make more sense to try to take care of that ridiculous inefficiency that is extremely expensive for us, both in infrastructure and in time costs? And just make everything more efficient. So what if we started to say, that if we could just get 2 people per each car, right? I mean, you would almost half the number of cars, the number of trips that we see out there. If we could, one of the things that we think would be really interesting is to look at something that we call a geometry tax. So is it possible that we think of how much space you're taking up per person, and that there's a charge for that? So if there's only one person in an enormous car, or only one person in an enormous bus, that's not an efficient use of our infrastructure, of this thing that's on the the streets, which are a limited resource. And so what if instead we said, okay, well, we're going to charge you for how much space you take up, and if there's many people on that trip, that's going to reduce the overall cost. But that way we're trying to work efficiencies into the system, which already exists in all sorts of other systems that we've got where there's limited capacity.
Right. I think what you're saying really is, in addition to the changes to street design, that we can use this type of a fee or a tax, whether it's VMT or geometry, to try to incentivize behavior that would help everyone.
Yeah. And to go to the point that a lot of the projections that we're seeing, and we're already seeing this with with TNCs, the amount of VMT that's being created by TNCs is staggering, right? A lot of these presentations that just happened at the Transportation Research Board TRB conference in DC was just showing 30% increase in VMT for TNCs compared to other, and people taking more trips than they would otherwise. And so this isn't just we're kind of growing and that things are going to get a little bit worse. This could be dramatically worse, right? Like huge strains on systems that are already really strained. So you can think of these new technologies actually giving us opportunities to deal with some of the problems that we've not dealt with well in the past.
Yeah, it's interesting. I kind of am of two minds about some of the studies and things about TNCs and traffic, in the sense that, I think you're right. Obviously, for a long time in this country, we've tried to encourage carpooling and, getting more people into per vehicle and using transit and all of those things because of our traffic headaches. On the other hand, autonomous vehicles present this opportunity to create mobility for everyone. And it is true that as soon as you open up mobility by making it cheaper, by making it available to the elderly, to the young, to the disabled, so many different people who have not been able to have the convenience of a car for so long, it does open it up to additional trips. And frankly, even the economic reality of people are going out more. You talk to young people in San Francisco, and they're like, we can go out to dinner in the Mission on a Friday night. And, some of those TNC trips are not all in the commute hour. When you look at some of these details, Friday is the most popular day for TNC trips. Well, everybody knows the commute is really light on Fridays. They call it Friday light, So, those are evening trips. And so communities can benefit. I mean, it seems like, should we also be measuring the economic good that comes from greater mobility?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And you see it a ton, especially like, for instance, with elderly people. And if we can drop the price of trips, the huge opportunities for much better mobility for people who are economically disadvantaged, great. But what you worry about is this kind of tragedy of the commons, right? So if, all of a sudden, if we have a field that all of a sudden we can all use and we all decide at the same time, oh, great, I'm going to get that one extra cow, right? And everyone goes and feeds at the same time. Well, the thing's destroyed, right? And that's the concern with this thing. We've always thought of the streets as a public good that we can all share in good and everything. Well, the truth is it's got limited capacity. And so we need to start, especially with the steep rise that we might be seeing, we need to start figuring out ways to deal with that. And this new technology, right, everything from the AV to all the app-based, pieces that go with it, allow us a huge opportunity that hasn't existed before, right? The way that we can collect and analyze data about trips is something that's never happened before. And so we could be much more efficient about, chances are in the San Francisco area, I'm going to guess on any given morning, there's a couple people, I'm going to guess more than a couple people that are going more or less to the same direction, and not too far from each other, right? That's impossible for us to guess right now. That's impossible for us to guess and for us to coordinate. But when we all of a sudden have, big data, lots of information about how people are moving around, and lots of, through apps like real-time knowledge of what people want, there's opportunities to take advantage of that. And that is, on the one hand, great for the efficiency of the system, reducing congestion, reducing, kind of delay, reducing headache, and also making it tons cheaper. So, if we want to increase mobility for all, what better way to do it than that?
Yeah, it seems like, the popularity of things like Uber Pool, Lyft Line, it is again kind of leading the way and showing models for ways to get more people into vehicles. And then, you kind of step it up and you see microtransit, vans and shuttles like Chariot. Do you think that that's the direction we're going? In other words, that cars need to be more like buses and buses need to be more like cars, in the sense of sort of a coalescing on smaller, more on-demand ways of getting around that are convenient like cars, but maybe have more people in them, more like a shuttle?
Yes, yeah. So it's kind of funny because I'm loath to say to make cars more like buses because that just seems like a not winning situation. But I mean, it's a different thing. So when I get into a Lyft line or an Uber Pool, the experience is almost exactly the same as me getting into a taxi, right? I mean, I get in, I give a brief nod to the people next to me, and then most everyone's on their phones. So it's not like we're degrading the experience, right? And I didn't have to wait a tremendous amount of time for that. And if it takes me 2 blocks out of my way, most people don't even look up from their phones to realize that that's happening. So I mean, it's a really different model than the way we think about buses right now or transit right now, where it's got a set schedule and I have to wait for the thing, and I have to modify my schedule tremendously to work with those things. I mean, this is a much more kind of user-friendly kind of experience that I think could be really positive. And the studies that come out of New York with Bruce Schaller's work, and I heard it 2 weeks ago from people at Uber themselves, that the largest amount of kind of uptake of Uber Pool is in areas not in downtown Manhattan, but in areas outside of Manhattan, right? In places in the suburbs, strangely enough, and places that are most price sensitive. And this is absolutely a much better economic model, right? I mean, you ask any of the TNCs, would you rather have one person in your vehicle, or would you rather have like 3 or 4 people each paying you even a reduced fare, but each paying you a fare? Oh, everyone wants 3 or 4. That's a much more efficient, like a much better business model. And so my sense is that, you know, price will drive us. Its price sensitivity seems to be pretty powerful for a lot of people. You know, not for everyone, but it does seem pretty powerful. And then the other thing you have to think about is we have to stop thinking about you and me. I've never seen you before, so I don't know how old you are, but you know, I'm in my 40s. But you know, and are kind of comparing what we have right now to that future, as opposed to, you know, my 7-year-old who one day, you know, is going to start using Lyft and Uber and Via and Chariot. Hopefully they'll come out here. And this just becomes one other way of getting around. And it's not this huge like change of the way that they live. It is the way that they live.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. And, you know, as you're pointing out, you know, some of these benefits, do you think that public transit then will need to follow some of the lead of things like an Uber pool or Lyft line or Chariot, and that, you know, in addition to you know, our kids sort of being used to this on-demand mode of travel, will that be the way they experience public transit as well?
Yeah. So I think transit agencies are, if they're not paying attention, they're done. I mean, it is a huge moment of transition. And, you know, I love some of the work that's happening in Los Angeles right now, LA Metro, where they're piloting different ways of working with TNC. So, you know, contracting out for the services, or using like actually them delivering the services themselves versus just letting it happen alongside. So there's 3 different models. But transportation agencies are going to have to completely shift the way that they work. I'll tell you, the local bus is probably done. Like, that's not going to exist that much longer. The higher capacity routes, it's hard to beat. I mean, you cannot beat the geometries and efficiencies of, you know, the light rail line or even the heavy rail line or the bus rapid transit. Those things will continue to exist. You try to get everyone into New York City and out of New York City in their own individual car. It's impossible, right? And so I think that there's absolutely a role for transit, absolutely a role for mass transit, absolutely a role for things outside of cars. But absolutely it's going to be expanding to beyond just buses and trains, right? I think shuttles will be a huge piece. And then there's all these questions that happen when all of a sudden you have these shuttles that are running everywhere. You know, one of the things we think about a lot in design and urban design and planning and development is, you know, the transit-oriented development, which is, you know, a huge trend in the country and all this. Well, what happens if transit's really shifting through this? What happens if you're atomizing transit, right? So like the shuttles are really picking up from anywhere to anywhere. Or do they go towards, you know, certain corridors, right? So that we have, like, you know, not a stop, but an area of stops. Those are really big questions for how this change in transportation will affect the organization of the city. And one of the things that we say all the time, which I can't believe I've been talking to you for this long and haven't mentioned it, but I think it's a really important thing for people to hear, is that AVs are not a transportation issue, or they're not only a transportation issue. They are an everything issue. They are going to affect this land use issues like we just talked about. They're going to affect equity concerns, and we can talk a little bit more about that with transit. They're going to affect land values. They're going to affect municipal budgets. They're going to affect all sorts of. They're going to affect housing costs. And the important reason to, I think, realize that is, on the one hand, you know, it's true that, I mean, that you think through these things and you see the ramifications all the way through these different parts of our society, of our communities, of our cities. And the second part is that some of the changes that are going to be needed to make sure that we do a good job and like integrate these things well into our communities and communities continue to be effective for the people who live in them, is that you're going to have to build political support to make those the changes necessary, that and the relationships and the partnerships necessary to make these things really work well. And the only way to do that is really to get people thinking beyond this is only a transportation issue.
Yeah, it seems It always seems like a little bit of a chicken and egg problem trying to figure out kind of public policy and city planning in this area, because on one hand you want to get out ahead and be proactive and figure out how you want your city to look, but on the other hand it's hard sometimes to make the rules ahead of time and when the technology is not quite here and people don't know how it's going to work in practice, and so you don't want to put rules and set rules in stone that turn out to be the wrong rules. And so when a technology is moving quickly and we're not sure how it's going to be adopted, how people are going to use it, sometimes it's a better approach to move more slowly. Are pilot programs really the best way to kind of do little experiments to try out new rules or new designs or ways of thinking about these things?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, it's a great question, and it's a really big problem that exists out there. And the advice that we're giving is actually, it was tremendously well framed by someone that we just listened to recently out in DC. But you have to think about what changes are going to come, how volatile is the future, and how predictable is it? For things that are somewhat predictable, that we can see like, oh, I really think it's going this direction, well, then you can be really anticipatory and you can start to say, okay, how will this be affecting all these other pieces? And let's anticipate those things and let's prepare for that. For things that you don't know exactly the way they're going to play out, you have to be more nimble, right? So it's more about being resilient, setting up structures that can move quickly, that can figure things out, or that are flexible, that are responsive, right? So it's one thing to say, I want this regulation to be this specific thing because I see the future being that. Or you can create a regulation that says, I will use this input from our environment of, what parking utilization is, for instance, to end up figuring out what kind of parking regulations we want to create or are part of the code, right? So it's this balance between being anticipatory and being resilient and nimble. And I think those are really important things for cities to be thinking about right now, and firms as well.
Right. So speaking of kind of the longer term impact and longer term planning, some of the impacts you've mentioned are on land value, land use, the question of sprawl, and kind of where we're going to live. How do you think autonomous vehicles will change where people live, and will location in some ways matter less?
No, that's a great question, and something that urban designers love to think about, and planners as well. So let me give you some examples of how it might change where we live. So let's say right now that you're willing to accept. I give this example all the time. I'm willing to accept a 25-minute commute, right, to work. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, and so therefore I find a house that's more or less 25 minutes away that I can afford. Right? That's my goal. All of a sudden with AVs. That 25 minutes actually will get me further, especially on arterials and on freeways. AVs should be much more efficient. So that will get me even further. And added to that, the idea that instead of spending 25 minutes with me, looking at the road and trying to sip coffee, I can do whatever I want. I can be working, I can be watching a movie, I can do exercise, I can eat, I can sleep, I can do all kinds of things. So maybe instead of only 25 minutes, I'm actually willing to accept 35 minutes or 40 minutes of a commute, now that it's got this different value of time. And so what that says is the place that I would be willing to live might shift tremendously. If land is cheaper further out, right, maybe I'll go further out. If what I really want more than anything in my life is this enormous yard, maybe I'll go further out. If what I really want is to live in the woods, maybe I'll go way out, right? And so the pressures on sprawl will be tremendous. I mean, there will be a tremendous increase in the amount that the city could expand. Part of the problems with it, on the one hand, fantastic, everyone gets to follow their bliss. On the other hand, there's huge kind of impacts on that kind of development, right? Which everything from energy use, depending on what kind of energy sources we have, right? The huge impacts for environmental issues, right? So we know that sprawl is tremendously detrimental to water quality and habitat. Those things will be severely impacted, but also in terms of social issues of equity, accessibility, affordability. All these things kind of are going to play together. And so sprawl is a pattern that we've developed in this country, and a whole lot of people are living it right now, and we're starting to feel some of the impacts of those things from the environmental side, obviously, and from the social side. The biggest one that has really grabbed people's attention is the fiscal side, right? So sprawl just costs more. Maintaining all these roads out, per unit, the amount of road and infrastructure, sewer lines, electrical lines you have to build just costs a whole lot. And you would be hard pressed to find a mayor in this country who does not say, oh my goodness, the cost of the infrastructure and maintaining this infrastructure that we've already built is killing us. So if there's all of a sudden this increased pressure on more sprawl, right, that is only exacerbating that problem. And so how is it that we, be it for any reason, for social reasons, for environmental reasons, for fiscal reasons, how do we make sure that we have these, that we incentivize the right kind of decisions so that we make sure we don't create problems?
Right. It's interesting because I sort of feel like in a world where you have to be at the office at a certain time, you feel like you go to the office every day for a reason and you need to show up there at a certain time, that you don't really want to live 2 hours away just because during those 2 hours you can take a nap or watch a movie, because that's still, it means you got to leave at 6 a.m, right?
Yeah.
So I hear you about people being willing to live further away marginally because they don't have to sit behind the wheel. But a lot of people say, well, nobody's going to take commuter rail anymore because they can all just get in their car, and even if it's an hour and a half in traffic, at least they're not driving. And I kind of feel like that piece of it gets a little bit overblown. I mean,
Agreed. Agreed.
If you can take the train and it's 30 minutes, are you really going to sit in your car for 90 minutes? I mean, it's the same decision we all make today, right? Today you decide like, hey, should I take BART or should I drive? And when you look at the difference in time, you say, gee, I think I'll take the public transit option because I really don't want to sit in traffic for an hour and a half.
Absolutely.
Same decision.
So absolutely. I think that, on the one hand, there is an absolute limit to how long. I mean, I want to be home with my kids. I do not want to be in any kind of transit, right, or transportation or anything, right? It could be walking or biking. I want to be home. On the other hand, I would never change my 20-minute commute to be a 2-hour commute. Never.
Right.
But 20 to 30 minutes, I might do, because maybe I can do the last I can get that last half hour of work done on the way home,
right,
as opposed to when I'm stuck driving, or I can do that one other thing that I want to do, or maybe that's my exercise routine. I'm really I'll get the AV that comes with a cycle in it, which I think is totally ironic. But I picture this and someone driving by with their AV next to a cyclist who's actually cycling.
Oh, that's
It's a funny image for me. But maybe I'll take that one, and that'll be my exercise program, right? My half hour home is doing that, where before I only wanted to have a 20-minute commute. I want to have. But even if we still absolutely accept the same amount of travel time, and like I said, I think that the use of time, and there's been some studies that come out of Davis and Georgia Tech that shows the use of time, having the ability to use our time for other things, absolutely changes the way that we think about the transportation and the amount of time that we're willing to spend in it. Right. But even if we didn't do that, AVs will still get us further, right? So there will be pressures on sprawl. That will absolutely happen.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that your 30 minutes, you might travel more miles in that 30 minutes. I think that's a really important point. Maybe it's just because I get motion sick, but I don't know. At least according to Wikipedia, something like a third of the population gets motion sick. So we're all going to be listening to podcasts. I don't think we're going to be able to be reading.
Absolutely.
So, we've talked about some of the short term and some of the longer term impacts that you think AVs might have on cities and regions. How do you think cities can start, bringing people together to talk about these issues and getting kind of the right constituencies in place? I think about some of the private AV companies and others, and sometimes they're not sure how to approach cities, and I think there are cities who aren't quite sure how to start making these decisions and how to get things going. Who are the people that you need to have in the room to start thinking about these? And are there examples or clearinghouses or places where all the best ideas are being funneled, where people can kind of reach out and say, hey, I want to get started on this. What are the best approaches?
Great question. Thank you for asking. So, first of all, I think the most important thing that has to happen, from the technology company OEM side, is that they have to decide that they want to engage in this conversation. And I hope that the things that we've talked about have given enough context to help people think that, we should be aware of this, and we should be potentially even engaged and involved in it. And so that's the first piece. The next piece is. With engaging the cities, it is a area of quick transition right now. So, I would say, come work with us. I mean, so one of the things that we've really been trying to do is organize kind of how to approach cities and how cities should be thinking about these things. Right now, we're working with a small city, Gresham, which is just outside of Portland here, a suburban city. Looking at every different department in the city on how it is that these new technologies, not just AVs, but also e-commerce and the sharing economy, are going to be affecting them. And so the idea is find people who are working on these issues and use that to engage with cities. I'll say, the conference that we're doing is like one of the primary goals. So from the city side, what's really important is this, we keep on saying this, of kind of pulling back the curtain. It is not very hard when you get people's attention to talk about things that they know right now, Amazon, Uber, Lyft, things that are a reality right now, and just have them think through what the ramifications for those things are as they increase in number, and all of a sudden, you have this shift, when AVs happen. And so it's really easy to get people from like, oh yeah, we're here today, to, oh my goodness, oh yeah, that's going to happen as well. Oh yeah, it's not just like, the car going out to like pick out milk for me. There's all these other pieces that are going to be affected. And I think that's probably one of the best things that can happen. This, as I mentioned, this pulling back the curtain, because what it does is it has everyone within their jobs, whatever it is that they're doing right now, from in the city side, it gives them, the question that we always ask them is, how does, as we think through these things, how does it change the project that's in front of you right now? Mm-hmm. How does it change the work that you're doing right now? Would you do this the same way? How does it change the project you think you're going to be doing in 5-10 years? Right? And what about, how does it change the plans that you're making, like the larger range plans that you have for these things? How does it change the data you think is important? How do you think it changes who you need to be talking to, what partners you need to be thinking about, and partnerships both within the city and outside of the city? And I think right now we're at a point where just asking those questions to people who really know their jobs really well is a huge step forward in starting to lay out, this, as I mentioned before, this anticipatory and resilient kind of approaches to these changes. So for people who are listening to this, who are interested in engaging with cities, I'd say, one, absolutely come to the conference. We're bringing together, the brightest minds in the country of people who are thinking about these issues, so both the information side and the application side. And two, come work with us, because that's exactly what we want to be doing. I mean, our goal is to create, help the transition into this future be as positive as possible for everyone, for the communities, cities, the public sector, the private sector, everyone involved. And so how we'd love to be working together to figure out how to do that.
What's the best way for people to reach out to you? I'll definitely put your websites and your contact info and the links to your conference, the Urbanism Next conference, on our show notes. How do you like to be approached? Is it email or Twitter? Or?
So, I'll give you a little bit of everything. So email would be great. So nlarco at uoregon.edu. It's a great way to get in touch with us. Twitter is at Nico Larco. And for information on the work that we're doing, you can find the website is urbanismnext.com. And from that, you can also reach a blog that we've got where we've been collecting a lot of this information. We're right now in the process of translating that into a clearinghouse, which kind of curates all that information. It's not just the chronological, the way that a blog is. But those are all great ways to reach out into the work that we're doing and get in touch with us. And we'd love to hear from you.
Terrific. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us today, Nico. This was really fun.
I really appreciate it. Great conversation, and I look forward to more.
All right. Take care.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. And thanks again to Nico for joining us. I'll put all the links to Nico's materials and contact information in our show notes, which you can find on medium.com by searching for the Smarter Cars publication. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.